This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Over the years, I've looked at a whole bunch of creature types in this series, but there's still plenty left, and today we're looking at another one, as this MTG Top 10 covers Incarnations. The Incarnation creature type was originally introduced in Judgment, and it has since returned in Lorwyn and Modern Horizons 2. There's also one creature from way back in Alpha that was retroactively given the type in Personal Incarnation. Incarnations have some pretty cool flavor. Most of them have single word names that are emotions or ideals, and that makes sense because the English word incarnation comes from the Latin verb incarnare, which means to make something into flesh. In other words, these creatures are what these various emotions and ideals would be if they were given a physical form. It should be no surprise then that these creatures tend to be pretty powerful on average. Incarnations also occupy a special place in my heart, as one of my most prized possessions is my Hebrew version of Glory, called Tehillah in Hebrew, a card that you've seen behind me in many of my videos, including this one. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have the Incarnation creature type. Now there's only 17 of them, but 10 have points using my system, showing you how consistently the creatures that have this type see play at Magic's highest level of competition. In this video, we'll take a look at the 10 of them that have left an impact on competitive Magic. Before we jump into the list, I do want to say, if you've been watching my content and enjoying it, do me a favor and subscribe if you haven't already. Half of my viewers are unsubscribed, and if you're one of those, I'd really appreciate your subscription. Alright, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours and Mythic Championships, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like Grand Prix and Magic Online Challenges. Now, let's get to our list. At number 10, it's Hostility, one of the Lorwyn Incarnations. This is a 6-mana 6/6 with haste that also turns every point of burn damage you do into a 3/1 with haste, which can result in some absolutely massive amounts of damage. Like all Lorwyn Incarnations, it also refuses to stay dead forever, and it gets shuffled into your library when it dies, or goes to the graveyard from anywhere. It gained its only point in a standard ramp deck back in 2007. It is almost certainly going to fall off of this list at some point in the future when we see some new Incarnations. At number 9, it is Guile, which is also a Lorwyn Incarnation. Hostility does a good job of embodying what red is all about. I mean, it's a burn payoff. And Guile does a good job of embodying what blue is all about, because it gives you some extra value when you counter spells. In particular, you get to exile the spell you counter, and you can play it without paying its mana cost. On top of that, it has a beefy 6-mana 6/6 body that can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. In the standard of 2007, Guile was played as the primary win condition in some mono-blue control decks, fittingly called mono-blue Guile Control. It hasn't gained any points since then, though. At number 8, it is Anger, the first Judgment Incarnation we've taken a look at. The Incarnations in Judgment all do something from the graveyard, and in the case of Anger, if you have it in the yard and you control a mountain, all of your creatures get haste. That's some pretty nice value for just getting this into your graveyard. It's also a 4-mana 2/2 with haste, but that doesn't usually matter because it doesn't get cast most of the time. Instead, it's largely been used in Reanimator decks, where it's just a great fit. You're already interested in milling and discarding cards in such a deck, and you want to bring back some huge creature or creatures, and if they can attack right away, you're usually going to win a lot more quickly. In Standard, it got its only top 8 at Worlds in 2003 in a fairly traditional Reanimator deck, where you could bring back Phantom Nishoba and some other huge creatures and attack with them right away thanks to Anger. In Extended, it was played in Sutured Ghoul Reanimator decks, which didn't just plan on attacking you quickly with a reanimated creature. They planned on winning the turn they reanimated the Ghoul, who would exile all the creatures in your loaded up graveyard, except for Anger, and that was usually enough for it to swing for lethal immediately. More recently, it's been played in some versions of Legacy Hogak and Hollow One decks, and it's in those decks that it has the most potential to gain more points in the future. Hollow One isn't exactly a Reanimator deck, but it does like discarding its hand for value, and that means Anger gets in there easily, allowing your turn 1 Hollow Ones to do damage right away. Anger is very likely to move higher up on this list going forward. At number 7, it's Genesis, another Judgment Incarnation. If it's in your graveyard, it gives you the option of paying 2 generic and a green to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This can include Genesis himself, so even without a loaded up graveyard, you can get this back, though usually if you have other things in your graveyard, you're going to be bringing that stuff back, so this stays in your graveyard. And yeah, Genesis's graveyard effect is really great to help you win a long game. In Standard, it was used in some decks alongside Mystic Snake, which is pretty nasty. It was played the most in Extended, though, where it was played in Blue-Green Madness, a deck all about discarding cards, and Gifts Ungiven decks, where grabbing this would really complicate your opponent's decision, because no matter what they did, you could get creatures back. It also has a single point that came in a Legacy Reanimator deck. While it was pretty heavily played between about 2002 and 2007, it hasn't gained a single point in about 15 years, and Anger is definitely going to be passing it in the near future. At number 6, it is Solitude. This is the first Modern Horizons 2 incarnation we've looked at. This cycle of incarnations all come with Enter the Battlefield abilities, as well as Evoke, which lets you pitch a card of the same color. Evoke means that the creature enters the battlefield and immediately gets sacrificed, but you get some real value out of the card for no mana. In this case, you get the Swords to Plowshares an opposing creature. Obviously, casting it normally can be pretty nuts too, as you get a 3/2 lifelinker that removes a creature, but the fact you can pitch a card and pay 0 mana for the Evoke is what really powers up these Modern Horizons 2 incarnations. Because they were printed in a Modern Horizons set, they're only legal in Modern Legacy and Vintage, but that's been plenty of formats for Solitude, as it has seen regular play in all 3 of those formats ever since being printed, and that's true for several of the Modern Horizons 2 incarnations, as we'll see as we move up this list. In Modern, it's been played in decks like Yorion, which also has various ways to blink creatures, which is pretty nasty with Solitude, and in Legacy and Vintage, it's mostly been played in Death and Taxes. It is going to keep gaining points going forward. At number 5, it's Subtlety, the blue Modern Horizons 2 incarnation. In this case, the Enter the Battlefield ability allows you to put a creature spell or planeswalker spell on the top or bottom of your opponent's library. Keep in mind, your opponent is the one who makes the call about where the card goes. On top of that, it has some pretty decent stats as a 4-mana 3/3 flyer. Unlike Solitude, its success has largely been restricted to Modern, where it's been played in a pretty wide variety of decks, including control decks like Blue Moon and Blue-White Control, as well as more aggressive decks like Crashing Footfalls, and combo decks like Living End, which can use it to protect their combo, and then they also get to reanimate it. In general, the Modern Horizons 2 incarnations are pretty sweet alongside Living End, and that deck got a big upgrade as a result of their printing. Like Solitude, Subtlety is of course also played in Modern Yorion decks. It does have a single point in Legacy though, coming in a blue-red aggro deck. It's likely to keep gaining points, though in the long run, the fact it has mostly only been played in Modern might hurt it in comparison to the other cards in this cycle. At number 4, it's Grief, another Modern Horizons 2 incarnation. Grief's Into the Battlefield ability gives you a look at your opponent's hand and lets you take away a non-land, and if you cast it the regular way, you also get a 4-mana 3/2 with Menace. Grief has already found significant success in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage. Being able to disrupt your opponent for no mana at all is pretty sweet. In Modern, it's almost exclusively played in Living End, in Legacy it's played in Reanimator decks, and in Vintage it's played in Dredge. It's going to keep gaining points in all 3 formats. At number 3, it's Fury, our 4th consecutive Modern Horizons 2 incarnation. This one lets you do 4 damage divided as you choose among your opponent's creatures and planeswalkers. This is something that can let you pick off several small creatures, or it can just be a removal spell for a single larger one. If it stays in play, you also get a 3/3 with Double Strike. In Modern, it has gained points primarily in Yorion and Crashing Footfalls. In Legacy, its primary home has been mono-red prison decks, and in Vintage, it's mostly used in Bazaar aggro decks. These decks are graveyard-centric, and they're really built around the powerful Bazaar of Baghdad, and they tend to run somewhere between 0 and 2 lands that actually produce mana, so having a removal spell that doesn't cost any mana is pretty nice for them. Like the other cards in this cycle, it's going to keep gaining points. And at number 2, it's Endurance, the 5th and final card in the Modern Horizons 2 incarnation cycle. That's right, all 5 of them made the list, and I think that shows you just how pushed this cycle is. They all came out pretty recently, in 2021, but they all already have a significant number of points, as they immediately all became heavily played in at least one of the formats they're legal in. Anyway, Endurance's Enter the Battlefield ability allows you to put a player's graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. This is most frequently used to hate on graveyard decks, but in a pinch, you can also use it on yourself. It also gives you a pretty beefy 3 mana 3/4 with Flash and Reach. Graveyard decks are a real presence in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, so it isn't too surprising that this has seen so much play. It has been played the most in Modern so far, but it does have points in all three formats, and it's closer to being a staple than the other cards in this cycle, as it is now one of the best ways to hate on graveyards, and it feels pretty likely it will always be the top dog in this cycle. So, the Modern Horizons Incarnations occupy the number 2 through number 6 slots, but they don't have the number 1 slot yet, because at number 1 it is Wonder. It's one of the incarnations from Judgment, and it grants flying to all of your creatures if you control an island and it's in your graveyard. In Standard and Extended, it was played in Madness and Psychotog decks. Both of these decks were all about discarding cards for value, which often gave you a huge creature early, and if you had Wonder around, that huge creature would also have flying. Psychotog was particularly nasty with Wonder because if you give that thing flying and you have a well-stocked hand and graveyard, it can pretty easily swing for lethal in a single turn. It was also a feature in the earliest Dredge decks in Extended, which utilized Icarid as the main win condition. Getting back your 4 Icarids with flying is a quick way to end the game. In Legacy and Vintage, it's mostly been played in Survival of the Fittest decks, where discarding Wonder to Survival is great since it can tutor you up whatever creature you want, and because you just discarded Wonder, you can count on that creature having flying too. More recently, it's been used in Hollow One decks, but so far it hasn't gained any points in them. Wonder is going to keep gaining points, and it is going to be interesting to see if it can continue to hold off the Modern Horizons 2 Incarnations. It is notable that it was actually reprinted in Modern Horizons 2 alongside all these other incarnations, but it hasn't gained any points in the modern format so far. My guess is that Wonder will get surpassed by at least 1 or 2 of the Modern Horizons 2 incarnations in the near future. Well, those are the 10 incarnations that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these powerful creatures, many of which are multi-format all-stars, check out the description where you can find direct Card Kingdom links for each of these incarnations. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and hit the like button. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, including many more on specific creature types, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.